To introduce Farah Pandith, who is our guest today, and the author of How We Win, and I really do highly recommend this book. It's a great read. It is filled with incredible and insightful information about what is happening with extremism today around the world. And most importantly, it's bursting with recommendations. So it is our privilege to have you here, Farah, and thank you very much for coming. Farah is the leading expert on countering violent extremism in this country, if not globally. She's traveled to 80 countries, talked to, held sessions with young students, millennials, religious leaders in the Muslim communities, as well as government leaders working on these issues around the world. And so it is really our privilege to be able to talk about her book and her experiences as we discuss this very important issue. She is also an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, which is another privilege I have to share with her, as well as being up at Harvard at the Belfer Center. But what's most important is the Council. But the other thing about Farah that I really want to highlight is the fact that she has had a extremely bipartisan background in government. She has served two Republican presidents, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, as well as President Obama. And I think that in this day and age, that is really important to highlight. It really is a tribute to your expertise and your skill. And let's get going on this conversation. So, we're going to discuss How We Win, and I also want to give you the subtitle, because that's also very important to the conversation, because it is a very inclusive book in terms of looking at all of the stakeholders who can play a role in this. How cutting-edge entrepreneurs, political visionaries, enlightened business leaders, and social media mavens can defeat the extremist threat. And she actually even has a role for individuals in your personal life as you go through your day, how you could participate in countering violent extremism. This is both a timely book and it's also a very positive book. It's timely, especially timely, now after the President's decision on Syria, and you're all reading about and watching analysts on television talk about how we may be seeing the rise of violent extremism again, and the rise of ISIS in the wake of what we're doing, what's been happening in Syria. But it's also a very positive book, and as I said, it's bursting with recommendations. So where I would like to start with this is you were there at the creation of countering violent extremism policy. And could you just explain, as we go forward, what is countering violent extremism, and how did you end up actually not only being at the creation of this, but actually leading the policy forward?
Well, so first of all, good morning to everyone. I'm sorry my back is a little bit too high.
Turn a little bit.
Should I turn? I think I have this set up just because of the video.
No,
so,
you can turn.
Oh, I can turn. Good. Better? Is that better? Okay. Hold on. Wait,
yeah, we can cheat the mic a little bit. Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
Yes.
Is this better? Okay. So good morning. And I'm delighted to be here, Marie, and I thank you for that very kind introduction. I was very privileged to be able to serve in government in a variety of different roles. But I will tell you that being part of the conversation around the ideological component to the fight to deal with an us versus them ideology was not something I planned. It's not something, I don't think anybody could have imagined that we would be structuring a strategy or a framework on how a government should deal with this. I came back into government after 9/11 because our country had been attacked, because I'm an American, because I'm a Muslim, and I had studied extremism in graduate school, and I just wanted to do my part, never thinking that I would spend as long as I did back in government. I thought I was going to come in for a couple of years, but though that moment post 9/11 when I was not in government immediately, but I know that our country was dealing with the kinetic component, the hard power component. How do we make sure that we are safe? who is this organization called Al-Qaeda? Are they going to attack us again? Do we have the defense system in place to make sure it doesn't happen again? Do we have the intelligence structure to make sure it doesn't happen again? All the things that all of you know. We stood up new departments, we collaborated and built partnerships around the financial, following the money of the terrorist organizations. All of these things were happening within the first year or two of the attack on 9/11. And obviously, policymakers were thinking about, well, okay, there's a piece of this that also has to do with how do we make sure that the armies that are being developed do not get replenished. And that means we have to understand how radicalization takes place. Why is a young person finding the ideology of Al-Qaeda at that time appealing? What can we learn? What do we know? What do we know about groups like this that use a narrative of us versus them? And I was in the National Security Council when those conversations were taking place, and I was very privileged to be around incredibly smart thinkers who had a chance to really think bigger than sort of the narrow piece of Al-Qaeda, but more broadly, how did we even think about ideology in the Cold War? What did we do? How do we set ourselves up? How do we deploy the kind of structure that needs to happen to do this? And part of that conversation was obviously government can't do this from the top down. We've got to understand what's happening at the grassroots. We need to understand what's making a young person find this ideology appealing, and make sure that we have the antibodies in the system to make sure that they are not able to build their armies. So for me, I came in as they were having that conversation and was able to talk about the component around young Muslim kids who were interested in this horrific terrorist organization, and why. So what happened was, as many different parts of the government were talking about this war of ideas, you've heard that terminology before, how do we set ourselves up? I happened to be there at that time when they asked me to think a little bit differently about what we could do. So countering violent extremism, CVE, is the term that's used, and you've read about it in the paper, is the non-kinetic, it's the soft power dimension of the war. Okay, it's how you stop the ideology of us versus them being appealing. And what is really important to say, and I know we will get this at some point, is that when we were framing countering violent extremism, despite the fact that Al-Qaeda was at that moment the most significant threat to us, we also understood that there were organizations like neo-Nazis, like white supremacists, like sovereign citizens, like a whole bunch of other groups domestically that use that us versus them ideology. And so if we were going to think about a framework on how to stop this, we knew that we had to include every component of what this threat might be.
And so getting to your...
I'm sorry. I'm just going to turn you guys so that you're facing out toward the audience.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, not at all.
We've never done this format before here,
No,
so
okay.
we're learning quickly.
No, it's all good. It's all good.
There we go.
Okay.
And I also apologize to my left side here. Is that better? Well, nice to see you.
Hold on a second, Lori. I mean,
Yeah, you can.
Oh,
Wendy,
sorry.
move
Yep,
the mic
sorry, I just
over.
did something here, sorry. I'm so sorry.
No, it's an old mic.
No, it's all good. I just want, there we go, okay.
Okay, so just picking up in terms of how the U.S. had been looking at this policy and continue to look at how to counter violent extremism. On the war of ideas side, one of your main themes is how the U.S. has gotten it wrong and continue to get it wrong in terms of really looking at the economic side of it, that there was a lack of opportunity or it was a hatred of the U.S., when in fact you say that those may have played a role, but the central element that was going on that made extremism attractive and allowed extremists, particularly in this case ISIS, which was able to recruit over 40,000 young people from around the world, from about 100 different countries, to come in and fight the battle for the caliphate. That the main reason was a lack of identity among young Muslims. And could you just explain that? It's really
Sure,
fascinating.
and it's important because I think anybody that looks at this horror in the context of 9/11, you have your theories on why this is happening. And let's be fair, I mean, smart people can be mistaken in how they think about things, but you react emotionally. You think, surely they have to be really undereducated to do something so horrifying. Surely they're really poor, which is why this is the only thing that they can do. I mean, there are all these ideas that people have in their head based on, you know, one's experience, but also one's experience as oneself. But we have to not do that. We have to actually go into the communities and find out what is actually happening to these young kids, that they would find the horrifying narrative of the so-called Islamic State or Al-Qaeda or Boko Haram or the Taliban, whatever it happens to be. Why are they finding this appealing? And what we know certainly is that for a young person growing up of any kind, I mean, every single one of us went through this as we were going through our adolescence and young adulthood, you are asking questions about who you are, aren't you? You know, what is the purpose of life? What am I supposed to do? Who am I? I mean, that's normal. That's absolutely normal. But for us to think about that in the context of what's happened post 9/11, when all day, every day, offline and online, kids who happen to have either be Muslim or have a connection to Islam or culturally are from this background are seeing the word Islam or Muslim on the front pages of papers online and offline every single day, 24/7. People are asking them about this one piece of their identity, whether or not they're overly active in that component of their identity or not, which has pushed them in a dimension that says, I want to learn more, or I'm seeking out answers. And who is offering the answers to them in the easiest possible way? It is not normalized great voices. It is the extremist voices that are present and available to them to say, you want to be a Muslim? Come over to me. I'm going to show you how to do this. And I know that I'm simplifying it, but you will understand, because, you know, it's the same kind of thing with gangs. I mean, you want to belong to something. You want to belong to something and feel like you're respected and you're part of this. So we asked questions about all of this post 9/11, and we wrongly suggested, I mean, these questions about why do they hate us, or we're winning hearts and minds. Those are great questions, but those aren't connected to what it is that we're talking about in terms of this ideological struggle. And what I found out in these dozens and dozens of visits, hundreds actually, of visits all over the world, was that no matter where I went, which was stunning for me, this was a great shock for me, that Muslims living in a Muslim majority country, as well as Muslims living as minorities, were experiencing the exact same identity crisis. But it wasn't enough for that data point. The data point was who? What age group are we talking about? And what I discovered was that those under the age of 30 that were growing up post 9/11 were the ones that were most active in understanding and trying to get and seek answers from sources that seemed authentic and credible to them, not to us. I mean, we're running around going, who's the guy with the longest beard and the highest hat? They surely can speak for Islam. That doesn't matter as government. I want to talk to the 14-year-old kid and say, who is a credible voice to you? And can that person make a difference to the way you think about your identity? So it has to do with a demographic, okay? Those young kids under the age of 30 globally. It does not have to do with, are you rich or poor? Are you educated or not educated? Are you male or female? Which is the other big mistake we made. Surely Muslim women could never get radicalized, we thought. So all of these things that were assumptions that were wrong. So I bring it back down to the real basics. There are certainly, and arguments can be made, that the economic dimension and the educational dimension are aspects to this. My argument is that's a tier 2 or tier 3 component to this, because I can tell you that there are extremists that are going to pay you to put yourself in the situation, and that's an economic component. But it all has to do with, I want to belong. I want to be seen as being something that offers me this identity so that I feel real.
So let's go to the sources of helping this millennial group and Gen Z. figure out their identity, the sources. You spent a lot of time talking about and analyzing Saudi Arabia's role, the role of Wahhabism, Saudi Arabia's promotion of Wahhabism, and that also brings the other central insight of this book that I found, we were talking about this earlier, the most fascinating and illuminating, which is the globalization of Islam. And some of you may remember, although I don't think Stanford did the program, but I think it was 2011, 2012 when I was president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of America. We did a joint program that Carnegie Corporation in New York funded on understanding Muslim societies, and we offered 20 Carnegie scholars to about 20 councils around the country, and the councils competed for the programs, to understand Muslim society. And it was a very diverse set of conversations. So it was about Muslim societies in Asia, Muslim societies in the Middle East, Sharia law. It was Afghanistan. It was very diverse set of conversations. And what I found so fascinating is what has happened since then is a globalization very much promoted and funded by Saudi Arabia over really pushing out this conservative extremist version of Islam, and explain that more deeply.
Sure, and I want to say a couple of things as I do. One is, you need to know that I grew up outside of Boston. And that's important because I don't want you to think I'm coming at this with a dagger in Saudi's back of any kind. I grew up going to a mosque in Quincy, Massachusetts, which has really wonderful American historic roots. And when I grew up, there were Muslims from all over the world. I mean, there were people from Trinidad, and people from Pakistan, and people from Turkey, and people from Bosnia, and Somalia, and so what? You know, we went to mosque on Sunday, and that was fine, and nobody talked about anything about like what the real Islam was. And so when I came into the realization that something much bigger had happened, it was a surprise for me. I just wanted to say that to you. This is not like I came in thinking I was going to know all of this. But what I discovered in traveling on behalf of our country was that no matter where I went, I was hearing and seeing things that were setting a pattern that really freaked me out. One was many older members of the communities that I visited would say to me, it's about the Saudis. They've been here for decades, they've been giving money, they've changed who we are, we're seeing changes that never used to be, they've Arabized who we are. This is not the old tradition, and we're worried. I would also see the techniques, the tools in the toolbox that would be typical, in this country also, by the way. Translations of the Quran by Saudi Arabia that took out the nuance of the translation so that it was very stark and said a very particular thing, and they gave that translation of the Quran for free all over the world. I saw textbooks that would teach children really an us versus them kind of framework. I pulled off of shelves, Leicester, UK, that story's in the book, where I pulled off of a shelf in Leicester a book that told me that all Jews were pigs, that was printed in Saudi Arabia. I mean, I could go on. I mean, there are many tools in the toolbox to get an effect. What is the effect? What they have done over 30 to 40 years is spend billions of dollars to reshape how young kids think about being Muslim. So that rather than the diversity of Islam that I've just described to you in my mosque in Quincy, Massachusetts, or the diversity that exists on planet Earth, because Islam has been on planet Earth for 1,400 years, it is a diverse religion, they want to make it a monolith. They want to say there's only one way to be a Muslim. Now, let me be clear. As the US government, we cannot go around saying this is a good Christian, that is a bad Christian, that form of Judaism is good, that form of Islam is good, that's a good Hindu, that's a bad. I mean, we do not do that. So it isn't a question of we are not allowing Saudis to express themselves and how they understand Islam, but when you build a machine that teaches violence in the name of religion, we have a problem. And what I'm saying in the book here is, let me tell you, reader, the things that I have seen around the world, and we as the United States and as a functioning humanity need to push back against this machine that is out there, because at the end of the day, it is very dangerous for all of us to see a monolithic Islam, to see the eradication of cultural history and heritage. I mean, Hitler did this. He understood how important culture was, and that if you can scrub away thousands or hundreds of years of history and replace it with something else, it only takes a generation before everybody forgets what came before. So for me, this chapter called Plague from the Gulf is really a deep dive into all I saw around the world. I bring you through stories from China to Kosovo to Europe, and I tell you what I saw. I am not spinning anything for any ulterior motive. I am simply saying things also that my colleagues in government told me. I'll say one more thing. When I left the Department of State, having had an extraordinarily lucky and privileged series of jobs, my last one was the special representative to Muslim communities on behalf of our country. And when I told Secretary Kerry that I was leaving, everybody was really surprised because I loved my job and it was the best job in government, frankly. And I was asked why. You know, why are you doing this? Now, as a political appointee for 11 years, which is crazy, like nobody does this, for 11 years as a political, I said the main reason was because I have a muzzle on my face talking about Saudi Arabia as US government. And I care a lot about what's happening globally, the radicalization of these Muslim kids, and I know that the most important thing for Americans to understand is the role that Saudi Arabia is playing. I have to get out of the State Department so that I can speak freely on this. And I'm not calling for America never to have a relationship with Saudi Arabia. I'm not that naive or ridiculous. But I am saying that there are things that we can do hand in glove with the things we need to partner with them on. And the pieces that I spell out in this book tell you why.
And in terms of the private sector, there's a accreditation that's taking place that something is halal. And therefore it is authentic, and that's part of this globalization process. Talk a little bit about how the role the private sector can play in countering violent extremism, and also the technology sector. You have a fabulous chapter on that in terms of the role that Google is playing, and you have some recommendations in terms of what the, particularly in the private sector, what the technology sector should be doing.
Well, so one of the things that I noticed, I got to my 30th country and I was like, this is really weird because I kept seeing the same thing over and over again. I was seeing young people who were displaying Islam like a lifestyle brand. You know, I mean, I don't know how to explain it other than to say they want to be cool, and so they want to dress and act Muslim so that they're connected to their peers in a very specific way, the way you would wear a Red Sox cap because you want to let everybody know that that's where you're from and that's what you do. Yeah, you may love the team, but there's an aspect to it that is also inclusion, isn't it? It's like I want to belong. I belong to something. And so, or here's another example. Some of you will have a Fitbit on your arm or something like it, and some of you are real athletes that really need that. Others want to pretend you are, and so you have it on there to say, "Hey, look at me, I'm super cool," and I'm counting how many steps I take every day. Now, that is the kind of approach that I was seeing these kids were, you know, and who was anybody? I mean, religiosity is on the inside. What can you ask about somebody's heart and who they are spiritually? You can't see that outside. But I was noticing with these young kids that there were certain things that were happening that were uniform around the world, where they were dressing a particular way, they wanted to be in the in-group, but they also were really making a statement to say, hey, look, I want to touch it, feel it, I want to show you that I'm Muslim. So it got to the place that it was crazy. So it's not just what you're eating, or what you're dressing like, or the phrases that you're using, or all of it. It was a whole thing, and I called it, in the chapter is called halalization. It's a crazy word I made up, but it's the only way I could describe what it is that I was seeing. But on the context of the actual halal, like kosher, you know, there is a function to that that is religious, but there's also a nonsensical component to it. So, for example, there was halal water in New Zealand, which I thought was very, very smart of the business person. I mean, hey, why not pay 10 times the amount for a bottle of water because it's halal, and it is, but I mean, that's absurd. Or, you know, this lipstick is halal, or this jacket is halal, or, I mean, the industry is phenomenally huge. And I don't think most, multi-billion, and it's growing. I mean, it is like, if those of you who are in business, like, this is your ticket, okay? It is really, really amazing how the many dimensions of it that are not just about food, it's about a lifestyle. So that's one piece, but that's not the only thing I argue with businesses. What my hope is that people understand the consciousness of what's actually happening in an environment. What is the air that you're breathing around hate and extremism? Because that makes a difference to your identity. That makes a difference to how you belong and how you feel. And the only people that affect that are not just government, obviously. It is local mom and pops, it's larger organizations, it's how you talk about who we are, bless you. It's how you talk about who you are. And what I say is, I believe companies need to be thinking about when they're looking at, I mean, the Business Roundtable just put out that piece about corporate purpose and how there's more to life than this is my spin on it, that's not how they said it, but there was a financial argument for this, but I completely concur. If you're looking at ESG, if you're looking at any of these things that companies are now aware of, think about climate change. Think about all of these other issues that, you know, 20 years ago you would never imagine a company taking a stand on social good in LGBT issues or on racial matters or anything like that, but now you're all of a sudden seeing multinational companies saying, look, we have a role to play because the touch points and how people affect and live their life, we connect. So whether you're Paul Pullman of Unilever or you're, you know, the guy who runs Dick's Sporting Goods, you're making political statements and policy statements in what you sell and who you are and what you believe in. And so the cohesion and the fabric of societies is something we need to get real about. Because the kind of extremism we're dealing with today are not just the so-called Islamic State and those that are going to try to recruit, and God forbid something that happens, you know, on Boylston Street in Boston on Marathon Day, but in fact, there's so much more. You know, 2019, we've seen the rise of all these groups I just described, but oh my God, we now see the rise of the kind of hate groups that we thought didn't exist in this country. So the white supremacists and the neo-Nazis, and you've got to be kidding if you don't believe that it is related. And it is related, because even though those kinds of groups hate each other, they're going to look at the best practices, as you would if you're an evil person. Who does it well? Who spreads hate really well? Oh my gosh, I'm a white supremacist, but boy, ISIS did this really well online, so I'm going to copy what they did. Our message is going to be different, but their technique is really powerful and it's going to work. So I look at the crisis we are in around the rise of hate, and I say to corporates, get with the program. There's far more you can do. If you wait for government to do this, there are lots, as you know, lots of solutions for government in here. I'm not giving government a pass. But I'm saying the corporates need to take a real serious look at things. And some of the corporates I talk about in the chapter called Shake Google, where I speak specifically to the technology companies because, as we know, there is the algorithm problem on a Facebook or a Google or a Twitter where you're moving a particular message in a particular way so that you're absorbing content 24/7 in a defined way that it's delivered, which is not helpful to fighting hate. You get into your little silo, you can't say anything but that. And I say to those technology companies, I would ask that they look more deliberatively at their algorithms and what they stand for, but that they also understand that the frontline workers and this entire thing that I am talking about, which is, by the way, I mean, the headline here is, solutions are available and affordable right now, right? I mean, this is not 50 years down the road or 800 years in the future. This is happening right now. And the people that are actually working on deploying the kind of antibodies to fight hate in the system are non-government organizations that need money, they need data, they need skill set. So I say to these technology companies, it is not enough what you are doing. You need to work hand in glove with these NGOs to deliver to them the things that they need so that they can do the work that we are asking them to do on behalf of humankind.
Well, I would like to open this up for questions from our audience, and we're always a very vital audience.
Make sure you speak loudly with your questions so everybody can hear.
So why don't we start right there?
Hi, I'd like you to address a little bit more domestic terrorism.
Yeah.
Because when my son goes to school, I'm not afraid of a Muslim terrorist. I'm afraid of a school shooter and more domestic terrorism when I think about it every day. Can you, a little
Sure,
bit
so I'm going to push back on you for a minute because I think the way we describe things is really important. There is no such thing as domestic versus international. You're saying is you're afraid of something happening in our country. But the ideology that allows that shooter to do what they're doing is not contained to America. They're learning it. These are millennials and Generation Z who are digital natives and with a swipe of their finger, as you well know, are connected around the world. When the horrific attacks happened in Christchurch, they were connected to, or El Paso, or what happened in Oslo. Everybody is learning from each other. Everybody's learning from their different manifestos. They're riffing off of each other. They are collaborating intellectually. So when I think about the kind of threat that we are dealing with here in America, which is not insignificant, there are cases open in every single state in America. No, and I'm not trying to send you away with fear. I need to send you away with hope. You don't learn, you are not born hating. You learn how to hate. And I don't see one candidate out there in any form or shape that has described their solution to fighting hate in America. And it is not about guns only. That's a completely different conversation that we all have to have. But it's what's happening emotionally to young people that they feel like the way they're going to express it is to buy into an ideology from an extremist group that says to go to some school and go crazy. So it is a threat. It is a threat because the white supremacists, the neo-Nazis have learned from what's happening in Europe. They're getting money, they're getting training, they're getting intellectual stimulation, they're learning tactics from groups all over the world, specifically in this particular domain that you raised, from European, the success of the European models, right? I expect in the years ahead this kind of extremism to surge. And I don't want to get political, but I have to sort of bring you the context. If we had leadership in the United States that was active in puncturing that kind of hate, you couldn't see these kinds of groups thrive. You wouldn't see the money come to them. You wouldn't see the energy and the ammunition come to them in the way that they have. But it is the opposite of what I've just described. So I don't see a reduction of that kind of hate, but I do see a consciousness change. I've been on the road with this book since March, and I know that people in America are really scared about the kind of extremism that you are talking about. But what I say to everybody is, and what are you doing about it in your towns? Stop waiting for some grand strategy from the Department of Homeland Security to arrive on your front door to fix this. As you as a parent, you as a teacher, you as a librarian, I talk a lot about libraries in the book. I think that they are the heart of cities and towns. There's a mayor in Louisville, Kentucky, named Greg Fisher, who has made Louisville a city of compassion. And you might say, that's really cute and very Pollyanna-like. But he uses the word compassion, he told me, at least 15 times a day in his speeches and whatever. When you have the leaders of your towns and your cities talking in a different way, changing curriculums in schools so they include that kind of thing, when the artwork in the city is about compassion, when you hear and see this and breathe it all day, every day, it changes the feeling. Now, is Louisville protected forever from something horrible? No. But it's adding to the antibodies that we need in the system to prevent this. So I don't see a reduction on the immediate side. I think the opportunity for us to do far more in America is there. There is a plan that I was very fortunate to be part of an advisory council. When I got out of government, I was asked to serve for Secretary Jay Johnson's Homeland Security Advisory Council as chair of the task force on countering violent extremism. We created a 50-state plan on fighting hate. And it wasn't just Al-Qaeda and the so-called Islamic State, it was on hate and extremism and what we need to do. And one thing I haven't mentioned, which I really would like to mention because I think it's extremely important, we haven't included social scientists in this conversation. And we must. There are experts in our nation on child and adolescent mind development, and they will tell you what to do and what we need to be doing in communities to push kids in a very different direction. If a human brain doesn't get developed until the age of 24, we have a lot of space in that time to disrupt their thinking so that instead of finding that neo-Nazi content and expression wonderful, because they're mad about whatever it is they're feeling, they can move that into a different kind of way that is not violent. It's a great question.
I just want to make an unsolicited comment regarding our library. Here in Stamford, Alice Knapp is the director and a member of our board here, and she's begun a program called Civility in America, if I have it correct, and features speakers on a regular rotating basis, notable speakers. And it's a step in the right direction.
Thank you.
I have a rather unusual question. I do a lot of prison ministry work, and I've noticed that people that go into prison frequently change their names to Arabic and they become Muslim. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts on that. And it's a really important question, sir. It's a really important question. Obviously, every prison is different, and I don't want to say everything's the same, but there are lots of aspects to radicalization that we know are coming out of prisons. I talked about the Saudi Qurans, and I talked about the materials that are available and have been available in our prisons for decades, where nobody was looking at the source material. Somebody says, I want to read a particular thing, they're handing them a pamphlet that tells them something that we don't want them to really buy into. And there's not enough, there's not enough chaplaincy and other supports in prisons so that somebody who wants to explore the religion of Islam, let's say, has an opportunity to understand it in its fullest expression. And that becomes extremely problematic. There's a whole technique, obviously, of building the kind of support for extremist content through the prisons, and it's vibrant. So I think we have a lot on our plate right now through the Department of Homeland Security. This is one more thing that when we think about the Department of Justice and how they should collaborate, there's so much out there right now. Nobody is looking at prisons in the way that we should. But it's concerning, it's extremely concerning, and there's a reason why it's happening. And I would ask you, as you look at whichever prison you're working at, look at where the source materials are coming from.
Well, it's interesting because we do have a focus overseas on prisons overseas.
Yes.
It's interesting we don't have one here.
Yeah, first a comment. You don't sound like you're from Boston at all. The question is, you're telling us that Saudi Arabia, over the past 30 years or so, has been promoting globally a very conservative brand of Islamic religion. And as I understand it, part of that conservatism is putting women in a subservient role, as at least I see it. And I'm wondering how that can be an attraction to women and females into these extremist movements.
Well, it's a really important question. So first of all, within the context of the nation of Saudi Arabia, any country can do whatever they want to do, and so there's not. I mean, I can't make a. I can, but the culture and the system in Saudi Arabia is the culture and system in Saudi Arabia. But when you and they do, you're correct. There is a hierarchy. It is, and I could argue that people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones because we don't have it quite right here either. Just saying. But sir, I do get your point. you're asking something really important, and I want to take it outside of Saudi Arabia. How can people who've had freedom, I'm saying this a different way, how can a woman who's had freedom decide that they want to go down a route which gives them less freedom?
That's my question.
Right. And there are many reasons why that there's not one answer for you. What I have experienced in going to places that have been Arabized, in many cities around the world and towns, I have been told, and I have met with these women, that they get paid to cover, which is where the economic dimension comes in. You know, so there's one element there. Do they really buy into the whole thing? And frankly, I mean, you're seeing I am not covered. This is my cultural expression. My mother's not covered either. I was born in Kashmir. My mother is a physician. That's not something we do culturally. There are parts of the world where culturally people are covered, but I have no opinion on whether you want to cover or not cover. That's not the issue. The issue is why are people feeling like, in order to be a real Muslim, when they've been in communities where that hasn't been a cultural expression, they feel that they have to. And that pressurization that they get, the signals they get, that if you don't want to be one, will help you express yourself in a better way. You're going to get closer to God in that way. That sort of preaching on why and how it's the right thing to do, everything you've been doing in the past is wrong, this is the right way to express, has been extremely successful, and it comes through in preachers that are trained that are trained in Saudi Arabia and then sent back to different parts of the world that actually then uproot old traditions that were not a particular way. Women, you know, some women do feel that they want to express themselves in a very conservative way. That's their freedom to do so. What I have a problem with is when you have external pressure that comes in to say, you've been doing it wrong this whole time, and we know the right way, and we're going to change that. And that's where, when I talk to women who feel fear, they feel that's the predominant emotion, that if I don't do this the right way, because somehow I've been told that I will go to hell if I don't do it the right way, that's actually a very interesting technique that's been used.
First of all, thank you very much. It's really gratifying to hear the, your approach to the issue. I think your focus on people's identity and what they're all about is the key. But I'd like to hear. I suppose I will buy your book, but even before I read your book, I'd like to hear, outside of the United States, you spoke about some of the things we could do here, the compassion campaign and so forth, but in terms of combating CVE externally, such an enormous problem, what are the 1, 2, or 3 things that you think we should be doing to win?
Well, so I don't want to spend the whole morning talking about Saudi Arabia, but there's an element there of international awareness around the textbooks, the Qurans, the training of imams, the removal of cultural heritage. So one piece of Saudi Arabia we just talked about, and the architecture, right? So Bosnia is a perfect example. I don't know if some of you saw a couple of years ago, the New York Times did a really great piece. Carol Gall on Kosovo and the Saudization of Kosovo through architecture and what they've been doing. So, you know, this comes on every, so one answer is international community, what's happening in your backyard with Saudi Arabia, are you aware of all the things that are going on? Let's get rid of that piece. The other is the efforts that we need to place around the most authentic, credible voices within communities. And I think people forget, just think for one moment, if you are thinking about joining a horrifying group like that, what's the one voice that could talk to you and talk you away from that? That's a former extremist, isn't it? Somebody who's former ISIS, former FARC, former IRA, former whatever it is. I was there, I did this, here's why. So former extremists are really important for us. And what I call for in the book is for us to expand the networks that we've built of former extremists and get their content presented in a place online and offline and in methods that young people can absorb them and see them all day, every day. It can't just be one campaign on the weekends or you see an ad on TV and you think you're going to be able to do things. You don't sell jeans that way. You don't sell shoes that way. They need 24/7. So I'm calling on nations to get real about the kind of content that is put in front of young people using former extremists. I also talk very specifically about the role of women, and I will say with very clarity on this one point, because I've seen the changes that happen. Parents, first of all, don't even understand how kids get radicalized. Okay, they have no clue what their kids are absorbing, what they're seeing. Parents teach their children how to use the internet so you're not being consumed by porn 24/7. Okay, they teach their children what to be aware of for child predators online. Explain to me why a parent doesn't know the signals and what they need to teach their child to make sure that their kids aren't being lured in a particular direction. So the parental programs. I also talk about social services on the connection of, if you think about a parallel structure around suicide hotlines, we should have hotlines throughout the world that connect parents and young people to the right kind of people who can help them if they're seeing changes, the behavior. Mothers are often the first people to spot a change with their child in behavior. What does a mom do when she begins to see a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old begin to become somebody very, very different and get really weird, scary about that? The only option that they have is either to go to the police or perhaps go to an imam, but that may not be the right connection. So there are functionally things that we know that work for other things that can be put into place for this kind of stuff. I talk about these things in the book and many, many others, and I'm just giving you some like basic infrastructure things. The other is that I have an essay coming out, this is October, in November, about this idea, which is how governments are actually setting themselves up for this problem of the ideology. And we've been very narrow in our scope, thinking that there's only a few things that we can do, and each country takes it all on, okay, in a very, we're going to do a little bit of this and a little bit of this and a little, and then first of all, no country in the world has put their money where their mouth is. I didn't give you the stat, but I think it's important to give it to you. We've spent, as you know, trillions of dollars on the war on terror since 9/11 happened. You know, we've spent billions of dollars trying to fight ISIS, just ISIS. Guess how much money we've spent on the soft power dimension of fighting the war of ideas for ISIS, to stop, in other words, to stop young kids from finding the ISIS ideology appealing. How much money? 0.0138% of the budget that we put into fighting ISIS. Now, so I call also for governments to get real with their allocation of funds around this. You can't build a 24/7 machine. If we do nothing at all new, that's fine with me, as long as we scale everything that we have tested over 18 years since 9/11. We need a machine that's 24/7.
I think we have time for one more question. Do we have a, there you go.
I think you raise an interesting point about having a competing voice for the extremist voices that young people encounter on the internet that tends to put them into these silos. One thing that I'm sort of prefacing my question is, in the past, before mass communication, if you wanted to inspire a fascist movement, you had to physically go somewhere or inspire people that were in that physical location to go and give a stump speech in a beer hall or in a town square, which, just by the laws of physics, has an unmasking effect. You can't show up to a town hall with 1,000 replicates of you all echoing the same voice the way you can on Twitter, where you can generate all of this false amplification by creating false people who agree with you before you ever even made your point. So how we enforce at our borders, when you cross our borders or when you cross our town, either through soft power or hard power, checking a passport, or even listening to somebody's accent and judging whether or not they're genuinely from the place they say that they're from. How do you remove, how do you bring to our digital presence that authenticity that's necessary in order for people to accurately judge that what they're hearing really is as popular as it sounds and really is as cool as it sounds, and there really are that many people that agree with them.
Right, and it's such a great question. This is a much bigger question. You landed on like the mammoth question of the day, right? I think that if you talk to school teachers in grammar school, the way they are teaching kids to authenticate facts is actually really interesting. Because they're teaching them about how the internet works, how to do their research, how a wiki page is not a good source for an article, and why, and what they need to do. So they're teaching them these things. Our generations don't have, we've never been taught. Okay, we're just fly by night, we're learning this and we're reading and trying to figure it out. So one piece for me in all of this is education and understanding. I don't want to leave on a scary note, but you raised technology, so let me just say this to you. I didn't talk about AI. AI is in the book, and I strongly recommend you think about what happens when terrorist organizations are able to use AI for their nefarious ends. And that is connected to what it is you're saying. So I think that Americans, forget about humanity, let's just talk about America for a minute. Americans need to make decisions about the kind of country we want to be in and the kind of things that we absorb that are real and not real and how important truth is. And I think that's a policy and an emotional response, right? So what are you asking your elected officials to get serious about and why? And what are you doing in schools and communities around these things and teaching us? I think we've been lazy on hate, and I think it's appalling. And I remember in 2007, when after the Danish cartoon crisis, and I had been asked to go from the White House to the State Department to talk to Muslims in Europe. And everybody at the State Department was like, why are you, they were really mad, first of all, that the Bush administration was looking at Muslims in Europe, because that wasn't the problem. The problem was certainly the Middle East or Afghanistan or whatever it is. But there's a whole component of that in this book. But my point here is, when I began to go to Europe frequently, in the context of listening to what Muslims were experiencing in Europe, I was seeing something else. It wasn't my remit, but I was seeing something else. I was seeing the rise of anti-Semitism. And it was really scary. But not only did I see the rise of anti-Semitism, I saw the rise of Holocaust denial. At the very same time that those who had survived the Holocaust were dying because of their age. And I'm coming back to America and I'm talking about this. Like, do you guys understand? So when you see things, we didn't do anything. What is there to do? I mean, like, you know, okay, that's a data point. How horrible for us. I mean, groups like the ADL have been talking about the rise of all these horrible things that are happening. And I was like, yeah, okay. And now we have 780 incidents against Jewish facilities in America in the first half of 2019. That's their data from yesterday, okay? I can use that example, I can use other kinds of hate examples, but my point here is, if we're going to educate, we've got to educate on what news is real news, what is fake, how the bad guys do this, so that all of us have the ability to be conscious about what we absorb and how we understand facts.
Thank you.